Greetings gamers, my name is Anto and today I want to talk to you about my go-to map making software nowadays, and that is Inkarnate. This video is sponsored by Dungeons & Lasers 5, the world of Dea's Lair, more on them later. So for a long time I was the Wonderdraft guy on YouTube. I made a whole bunch of videos using the Wonderdraft software from Megasploot. I made a bunch of different tutorials and talked about how it was my favorite, and in the very first video, back in the days where we were filming under a bed, I talked about how Wonderdraft was an Inkarnate killer and how it was so much better than Inkarnate. Well, it's been about 4.5 years since then and a lot has changed, and we've come full circle, and I am now using Inkarnate again as my main map making software. I have been for over a year now. And today I want to walk through some of the features of Inkarnate and kind of talk about the reasons why I moved from Dungeon Draft over to Inkarnate and why I think that Inkarnate is better as a map making program than Wonderdraft is right now. There are timestamps down below for you to be able to jump around. We're going to start off and I'm just going to talk a little bit about the philosophy of some of these changes, why I stopped using Wonderdraft and why I prefer Inkarnate, and kind of talk about how I think this is the perfect example of single time purchase versus subscription models. Now I want to start this off by saying I really loved Wonderdraft when it first came out and when I was using it. I have dealt with Megasploot several times, which has always been a pleasure, but for me, Wonderdraft has kind of stagnated. There hasn't really been a major release for it in the last year, and even before that, releases were quite sporadic and we haven't had much in the way of new content or substantial new features in several years. Inkarnate, on the other hand, is constantly adding new features and assets. And it's that second one that caused me to go and look at Inkarnate in the first place, because the Inkarnate assets are much higher resolution than the Wonderdraft ones, which meant that when you're doing what I do, which is make absolutely enormous maps that are designed to be zoomed in real close, those higher quality assets means I can get a more granular zoom and a better looking map in Inkarnate than I can in Wonderdraft. Both of them are able to export out to 8K, but the base assets are just much higher fidelity in Inkarnate than they are in Wonderdraft. Of course, in both systems you can add your own assets, but I like to use the stock assets and maintain consistency throughout my projects. And watching this unfold over the last couple of years, how Wonderdraft came onto the scene and was just immediately better than Inkarnate and was really, really good, but then has only gotten a little bit better over most of its lifespan, whereas Inkarnate has just slowly and steadily just continued to get better, has kind of changed my mind on the way that subscription versus single-time purchase models work. So I used to be firmly in team, I want to pay for a thing once and just have it forever. And ideally, I would like to do that if the thing that I am paying for is feature complete and gets updates. The real benefit of these monthly subscription-based services is they have to fight for your money every single month to keep you as a subscriber or as a member or whatever, so they're really incentivized to keep giving you stuff. Now, stuff for stuff's sake isn't always good. I know several applications that go really heavy on feature bloat without fixing any of their core problems, but when a company focuses on fixing bugs and adding new features and also adding new assets, all kind of in line with each other, so the whole program just continues to get better, then eventually, over time, you surpass the single-time purchase. And that's pretty much what happened with Inkarnate and Wonderdraft. I used Wonderdraft for many years, I made a lot of maps in it, and then somewhere around halfway through my last campaign, my players did something to affect the world, and I needed to change my map. And I went into Wonderdraft, and it was just looking a little dated, and a little low resolution, and broadly the same as it had looked for the several years before that. So, on a whim, I decided to open up Inkarnate and give it a go and try and remake the map in Inkarnate. And doing that, I think, resulted in a much higher detail and a much higher quality map. If I still have the maps, I'll kind of throw them on the screen here so you can see the transition between using the two platforms. And then when it came time to make the map for my new setting, which is the dual cities of Talavaar, which is on the screen now, I used Inkarnate for that, and I spent many, many weeks and placed thousands and thousands of assets, but I can zoom right into this thing and it still looks pretty good. So with the whys out of the way, let's talk through Inkarnate. So I'm sure this won't be the last Inkarnate video I make, so if you want to see more map making content, make sure to hit the subscribe button. But for now, let's dive into Inkarnate and have a look around and show off some of what the program can do. So here we are logged into Inkarnate. I use Inkarnate Pro, which is $5 a month, or you can get a yearly version for $25. Now here you can see I'm logged in and it shows off all of the different maps that I've got going on, and we'll go through some of these and show them off in a little more detail in a little while. But for now, I want to hit create new map and walk you through the process. So the first thing that you're going to get in Inkarnate is this screen that asks you to choose a style. So there are a bunch of different styles available for the different kinds of maps that you want to make in Inkarnate. And that's another reason why I made the switch over. So previously I'd been using Wonderdraft for my high level world maps and Dungeon Draft for my dungeon maps. Well, Inkarnate can do both. It can do fantasy battle. It can do fantasy or watercolor battle maps for those smaller scale dungeon level maps. You can zoom out to a city level, and the city assets they have in Inkarnate are really good. I build all of my cities in this now. Or you can go fully out to a regional HD version. This is kind of a 45-degree kind of tilted angle look. This is my least favorite personally because I find it the hardest to use. I find it really hard to make good looking maps in that because you have to really think about perspective. Or you have Parchment World and Fantasy World. I'm going to start with Fantasy World because it is the direct comparison to Wonderdraft. So we're going to go ahead and choose that style. And then we get some options. We get our aspect ratio and our editing resolution. Now, editing resolution is different to your exported resolution. You can edit in a lower resolution than you export, or you can edit in the full resolution depending on the system specs of your PC. I recommend most people are going to want to stay to a 2K editing resolution and it'll be fine. The only time it becomes a problem is when you have a really, really big map. Sometimes the assets in the lower resolution editing, so when you're editing at 2K, the assets look worse than they really are. So one thing I found that I have to do semi-frequently is I have to export out my maps to make sure that things actually do look good because they look better in the export than in the live view. If you have a beefier machine, you can edit at 4K and you're going to get more of that resolution in the live preview version. So we're just going to start landscape and medium, and we're going to hit create map, and it'll load up our canvas, and then it'll tell us that my browser's not supported because I'm using Opera, and it's like, Opera is not supported. We'll just ignore that. Go ahead and full screen this, so we've got nothing but Inkarnate to look at here, and we'll just go over some of the UI. So over on the left here, at the top left, we've got the option to save, export our map, as well as some help details, changing the map details, things like that. We've got undo, redo, and our map history here, and then we're going to start off with this arrow here. This is just our select tool, so you can use it to move around assets and to move around the map with the middle mouse wheel. Then down beneath that, we've got the mask tool. This is how you create landforms as well as erase the landforms to create water. So if we have it on add, we can go ahead and draw in a whole bunch of land. If we do the same with subtract, we can take away portions of the land. So we're just going to clear all to get rid of that. And then down here at the bottom right, this is one of the big features that was missing from Inkarnate when Wonderdraft first launched, and that is a world generator. So this allows you to generate a bunch of landmass in a random kind of way, choosing how much of the screen you want to be ocean. So we're going to set it to just over 50, and then generate new world, and it will tick away in the background and then give us a bunch of random landforms, and we can keep doing that and we can get multiple options. So we'll do that until we get one that looks kind of nice, that I think, oh yeah, we can build something off of this one right here. So let's say we're going to build a country level map. So we've got several options here for countries. Maybe we've got an interior sea or some giant lakes, whatever have you, but we've got a starting point. Then we can go down into our brush tool, and that will let us change textures and colors. So we can open up the catalog, and you can see we've got a whole bunch of different options for colors and textures. And the thing that I really like about Inkarnate, it's not exclusive to Inkarnate, but it is a really nice feature when you find it. If you go into the advanced settings, you can go into filters and you can change the coloration of all of these things. So this was kind of a sandy desert brownie vibe to begin with, but we can move it over and we could make it, let's say, a green color, but maybe that's too green. So we want to pull down the saturation and also the brightness because we want a darker green. And then maybe we want more contrast so we can see more of that texture. And instead of the brown color that we started with, we now have a nice green color. That's a really useful way to use the texture from one style of brush and apply a different color to it. So if we go here and let's go with lava, and we'll just put some lava down just so you can see the base texture. And then we'll go ahead and change the hue to, let's say, be green and make it ultra saturated and really play with the contrast and the brightness so we get the texture. And then put that down, and maybe that could be like a giant vat of acid. If you were doing it in a battle map, you can do this on all of the brush tools in whichever version you're using. Really useful for creating variety and playing around with these filters, both in the brush tool, the water, as well as the stamps. That is what's going to separate a basic map from a more advanced map, and that's what's going to make it stand out as being a really cool looking map, and not just being a basic Inkarnate map. Because a lot of these programs, Inkarnate, Wonderdraft, Dungeon Draft, they suffer from a problem of you look at it and you're like, oh, well, I can obviously see that that is an Inkarnate map, or I can obviously see that is a Wonderdraft map. The reason being, a lot of people will go into the stamps, let's say, and let's say it starts with a default stamp of a mountain here, and this mountain is brown. They'll put the brown mountain on the green background, and it really stands out. Whereas you could go into the advanced settings, hit filters, and just change the hue to be green and place it down. One of those stamps looks much better than the other. Similarly, the other big thing that causes people to make maps that read straight away as, oh, that's an Inkarnate map, or oh, that's a Wonderdraft map, is scale. So if we're working at a scale of many, many miles here, these mountains are way too big. Like, get the size down. Get the size down much lower than it is, probably not all the way to 10, but much lower, and instead of having one big mountain, you have a range of smaller mountains. And if we zoom in here and have a look, you can see the default asset looks really bad against the background. Recoloring it looks a little better, still very out of place, still very recognizable as being placed asset stamps in something like Inkarnate. Once you start fixing the scale, things get a little bit better. So if we go ahead and grab all of these, and we'll copy and paste them. We'll copy and paste them. We'll duplicate them, and we'll put these up here. And I'll show you the way that we can make them look better. We'll get some smaller mountains. Zoom in a little bit here. We want to change the hue on these smaller mountains to be green, and we'll start layering in some little foothills here. And we'll do it on both sides, and then just place a couple around, and you can see the progression of basic stamp, regular size, looks really out of place, gets a little bit more in place with the color, then with the scale, then by adding in those textural elements, starts to look a lot better. And that's a really quick example of placing down some stamps as well. So if we open up the catalog, this particular world, the fantasy world, has a whole bunch of different stamps that you can place. Most of them have groupings, so if we open up the mesa here, you can see there's 9 different options for the mesa. You can place them as individual stamps if we just make them a little bit bigger so you can see. And you can turn on randomization, so it'll place different stamps every time you place. Or you can turn that off so you get more granular control of which ones you want. But then you can also come down into the advanced settings and go into placement, and you can change what you're placing. So do you want to place a single stamp or multiple? If we go into multiple and then change the area in which we're placing them, and then we can mess with the size and scale, you can see I can put multiple stamps down at once. This is really useful for placing trees specifically. You can place really big forests of trees really quickly and easily without having to click your mouse 1,000 times. Then we have option for text, pretty standard stuff. Again, you can change a lot of the information, the size, the color, the font, all that kind of stuff. Then we come into the path tool. Path tools are really, really useful for placing roads on your maps, for placing political boundaries, and you can also use them for a whole bunch of other stuff as well. So you can go and you can draw paths. It's a useful way to draw on the map, or you can use it to mark the path between locations And then once you've placed them, you can also change options for them. So we can lower the opacity so it's not so in our face. We can change the line style to denote different things. We can also change the color. So let's go ahead and make it bright green. And then you can also change the blend mode, which is a really powerful tool to be able to make things look like they're more ingrained in the map. So if we go ahead and change it to luminosity, you can see it blends into the map more. So you can do that with stamps as well. You can change the blend mode of them to be any of the options there. That can be really useful if you want to get some special effects on the go. You can make ghostly versions of any of your stamps, or you can really make it look like the stamp is part of the terrain. Let's say we had a lava field and we wanted it to look like there's a bunch of lava on top of the things and all around it and covering it. We have some options there as well. Then we come to notes, just basic. You can add notes. I never use this, but you might, so it's there if you want it. And then we get the grid option, so we can turn the grid on and off. We have the isometric grid, the square grid, and then the two different versions of a hex grid, depending on which way round you want the orientation. You can change the columns and rows, you can offset them, change the color, the width, the opacity, and what layer they're on. I like to mess around with the layers, because if you put it all the way on the bottom, all of your placed objects will stand above the grid. It can make it easier to see the map itself. So if we place it right on the bottom and drop our opacity down, we still get some of the grid appearance. So we can use it to track distances, but it doesn't get in the way of our beautiful map. And then finally, we have the filter tool, which will give us a bunch of different options to change the whole look. So if we click on parchment, that'll pass a sepia desaturated filter over the whole thing, but we can open that up and we can change the opacity as well as what layer that is on. So again, we can apply that to only our background or our foreground, and then we also have the option to flatten it to the background. What that'll do is bake it into the image so that it isn't a filter on top, which means you can add filters on top of filters by baking them into the image. Archon Studios are returning to Kickstarter with their Dungeons and Lasers line, and this time they're funding a brand new campaign set in the world of Deus Lair. Deus Lair is a dark fantasy setting filled with epic battles, fantastic beasts, and moral dilemmas where there is no clear right and wrong. This campaign includes a setting book which introduces the world of Deus Lair, as well as the unique peoples that inhabit it, and a full bestiary for the many new monsters and enemies introduced in the campaign. And speaking of monsters, the campaign is funding more than 400 different miniatures, which is the main reason to back it. Dungeons and Lasers have become known for giving buckets of minis in their Kickstarters, and Deus Lair is no exception. There are miniatures for the new factions, monsters, and playable races of Deus Lair, and you can also pick up some of their legacy miniatures from older Dungeons and Lasers campaigns here too. All of the miniatures are made from injection molded plastic. There's none of that PVC material here, and they all come in multi-part pieces on sprues. The project goes live on April the 11th, but the sign-up page is linked in the video description for you to go and get notified of the launch. A big thanks to Archon Studios for supporting the channel. Now back to the video. So let's have a look at a couple of the maps that I've made using Inkarnate. We'll start off with a small town map. This is the hometown for my PCs in my current campaign, the town of Holden. I made this based on a Watabu generator map. I'll put a link to that down in the description. So I used the Watabu generator to make my map, and if you look here, you can see that I imported that image as a custom stamp by going into the catalog and going up to here where it says upload. I uploaded the Watabu image, and then if we turn off all the other layers just so you can see, that gave me the initial version and the layout of my map. I drew my coastlines to match it, and then I started placing all of my buildings to match as well. So here I have placed a bunch of different building assets. You can see I've textured the ground with multiple textures. I've added farmlands. You can see I started by adding specific boundaried farmlands to begin with, and then kind of changed my mind and decided, no, actually I don't want that. And you can see I put them all onto one layer so I can turn them on however I want. And then I replaced all of that with general kind of wheat field texture all throughout because I didn't feel like I had enough farmland. You can see we've got multiple different layered options. So we've got some clouds here that we can turn off and on, as well as the kind of notes for where these roads lead to. This just helps add texture and depth and elevation to the map. And I've made a video talking about how you can use light and depth and texture to really elevate your maps before. I'll leave a link up there to that video. That one uses Dungeon Draft, but the principles apply to anything. So if we go ahead here and grab our brush tool, and we grab a nice dark version of the brush and zoom in here, you can see that currently we've got all of these buildings. They've got a little bit of shadow, but they don't interact a huge amount with the environment. So if we grab an opaque dark brush here, so if we grab this and start just darkening some of the areas between the buildings, and if our light is coming from the north of the map, we can kind of exaggerate some of those shadows here as well that are already placed from the regular assets. And then if you look at this clump of assets versus this clump, this one looks much more ingrained into the terrain. Obviously, I've not gone through and done this to the whole town, but that's a really great way to elevate your map. You do that across the whole map, it's going to look way less like an Inkarnate stamp-placed map, and it's going to look much more like a handcrafted map. Then we also have the Jewel Cities of Talavaar, which is the map for my current campaign setting. We'll go ahead and load into that. You can see it's taking a long time for this one because this map is enormous. It's a fully maxed out canvas, and there are tens of thousands of stamps placed on this one potentially. I'm not 100% sure, I can't remember off the top of my head, but we'll see once it loads in. Waiting for the map to load. Waiting for the map to load. Waiting for the map to load. So here we are loading into the Jewel Cities. It only took 16 years to load in, but the reason why is there are 35,500 objects in this map, so it takes a little while. So you can see here that I have, this is the whole region, and then if we zoom in, this won't show up as well in the live view, because as I said, we're only editing at 2K, we export this at 8K. I'll overlay an image of this section of the map, zoomed in from the final export, so you can kind of see the difference between the live view and the final image. But we've got countless assets, well, not countless, 35,000 assets here. And once you start getting it into this territory, it does start running a little bit sluggish, especially on my PC. I don't know whether I could upgrade anything to make it run faster, but we've got a whole bunch of different layers set up here with different information. So our very top layer, if we turn that off, you can see that turns off a lot of the stamps for locations. So all of our little town and city icons are all gone. All of our notations for where different things are, and the border that goes around the outside. Then our next layer will turn off the clouds and some of the roads and pathways and things like that. Our next layer starts to take off some mountains, and then layer 2 is where most of the stamps are. We turn off layer 2 and you can see we're down to individual groupings. So a lot of these trees along here, that is one big group of like 10,000 trees. Well, not 10,000, but thousands of trees. So this big group of trees here, that's thousands of trees grouped together, same down here. But you can see a lot of the coloration work that's been done to darken around the mountains, to give some textural variation in the ground so it's not so boring and blank. Now if we turn everything off so we've just got the color, and then zoom in a little bit here, you can see in just this section, we've got several different stamp types. So there's different grass types, so short and long grasses looking across here. We have different textures. There's parchment-y textures, there's cracked textures around here. And then we've got a whole bunch of different colors, all at various opacities, all put together just to make the ground more interesting than a flat green. And then when you turn everything back on, you can see how it all blends together. So that's my intro to Inkarnate. I'm going to be making a lot more videos on this software in the future. I am eagerly awaiting an update that has been announced, but we have no date for it, that's going to bring a couple of different map styles to Inkarnate. So a parchment style for the dungeon level map, as well as finally the ability to build square-bounded rooms in the dungeon level version. And we'll talk more about that when that update eventually drops, because I don't want to give a whole bunch of information on that in a tutorial or like an overview and then have them drop the update and it be irrelevant the next day. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to hit the like button. I'm interested to know whether you still use Wonderdraft or whether you've moved on, how you feel about its development, and what you think about how far Inkarnate has come in the last 4 or 5 years down in the comments below. If you like the look of the Dual Cities map, I have a whole video talking about that campaign setting and how I made it and presented it to my players, which you can check out just over here. But until next time, happy gaming.